The storm had been merciless, lasting 3 days and 3 nights, tossing the pirate ship Sovereign's Revenge like driftwood across the churning waters of the Caribbean. Captain Ezra Blackthorne stood at the wheel, his knuckles white as he fought to keep his vessel on course through the hurricane that had seemed to come from nowhere. The year was 1703, and these waters between Tortuga and the Spanish Main had become increasingly treacherous, not just from natural disasters, but from the constant warfare between colonial powers that turned every voyage into a potential battle. Blackthorne was a man shaped by hardship and tempered by years of survival in the most dangerous waters on earth. At 35, his face bore the deep lines of someone who had stared death in the eye countless times and refused to blink. His black hair, streaked with premature grey from stress and salt spray, whipped around his angular face as he bellowed orders to his crew over the howling wind. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a Spanish cutlass that had nearly ended his career before it truly began. The captain had not been born to piracy, though he had taken to it with the natural skill of a man who understood that survival often required abandoning the rules that civilized society pretended to follow. The son of a blacksmith in Bristol, Blackthorne had been pressed into service aboard a Royal Navy frigate at the age of 16, dragged from his family's forge by a press gang that cared nothing for his protests or his father's pleas. For 8 years, he had served the crown with distinction, earning promotion through merit and courage in battles against French privateers and Spanish treasure fleets. His transformation from loyal naval officer to notorious pirate had come not through greed or bloodlust, but through a single moment of moral clarity that had cost him everything he had worked to achieve. During a patrol off the coast of Jamaica, his ship had encountered a vessel carrying refugees from a Spanish massacre on the island of San Domingo. Women, children, and elderly men who had fled their burning homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs were being turned away from every port because they carried no gold to pay for sanctuary. When Blackthorne had argued for giving them aid, his captain had struck him down and ordered the refugees driven off at gunpoint. That night, Blackthorne had stolen a boat and ferried as many of the desperate families as he could to safety on a small, uninhabited island. When he returned to his ship, he found himself in chains, charged with mutiny and theft of naval property. His court-martial had been a foregone conclusion, and only the intervention of a sympathetic admiral had saved him from the gallows. Instead, he had been cashiered from the service and blacklisted from legitimate maritime employment. Piracy had been his only option for survival, but Blackthorne had brought to it a code of honor that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. The crew of the Sovereign's Revenge included men from every corner of the known world. Jacques Dubois, a former French naval surgeon who had fled France after dueling with a corrupt official. Malik ibn Hassan, a Moorish navigator whose knowledge of wind patterns and currents was legendary. Timothy O'Brien, an Irish rebel who had escaped English prisons, and dozens of others who had found in Blackthorne's leadership something worth following. Now, as the storm finally began to abate on the 4th morning, Blackthorne surveyed the damage to his ship and crew. The Sovereign's Revenge had lost her mainmast, and several of her sails hung in tatters. More seriously, their supplies had been severely depleted. The storm had contaminated most of their fresh water, and their food stores had been damaged by seawater that had found its way into the hold despite their best efforts to secure everything. "Captain," called Jacques Dubois from the ship's galley, his usually cheerful French accent heavy with concern. "We have perhaps 2 days of rations remaining, and that only if we cut portions to starvation levels. The water situation is even worse. We must make landfall soon, or we will lose men to thirst and hunger." Blackthorne nodded grimly as he studied the horizon through his spyglass. They were somewhere in the chain of small islands between Jamaica and the Spanish territories, but the storm had blown them far off their intended course. According to Malik's calculations, the nearest port where they could resupply was at least a week's sailing away, assuming favorable winds that seemed unlikely given the current weather patterns. "There," said Malik, pointing toward a smudge of green on the distant horizon. "Small island, perhaps uninhabited. We could anchor in the lee and send parties ashore to search for fresh water and food." As they approached the island, which appeared on none of their charts, Blackthorne could see that it was larger than it had first appeared, perhaps 5 miles long and covered with dense tropical vegetation. A small lagoon offered protection from the ocean swells, and they anchored the Sovereign's Revenge in water so clear they could see coral formations on the bottom 30 feet below. The landing party that went ashore consisted of Blackthorne himself, Jacques Dubois, Malik ibn Hassan, and 6 other crew members. They had been on the beach for less than an hour, searching for signs of fresh water, when they heard voices coming from the interior of the island. Following a narrow path that wound through the jungle, they emerged into a clearing where they discovered something that stopped them in their tracks. A small village of perhaps 20 huts had been built around a central fire pit, but it was clear that this community was in desperate straits. The structures were makeshift affairs built from driftwood and palm fronds, and the people moving between them showed all the signs of prolonged malnutrition. Men, women, and children with the dark skin and distinctive features of various Caribbean tribal groups sat or lay in whatever shade they could find, their eyes dull with hunger and exhaustion. As the pirates entered the clearing, the villagers looked up with expressions that mixed fear with resignation. They had clearly been refugees for some time, their clothes reduced to rags and their possessions limited to whatever they had been able to carry when they fled whatever disaster had brought them to this remote island. An elderly man who appeared to be some sort of leader struggled to his feet and approached the pirates with as much dignity as his weakened condition would allow. He spoke in accented Spanish, then tried broken English when it became clear that not all of the pirates understood his first language. "Please, señores," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we have nothing of value to steal. We are refugees from the Spanish attacks on the Mosquito Coast. Our villages were burned, our people scattered. We escaped in fishing boats and have been here for 2 months, waiting for rescue that will never come." Blackthorne studied the old man's face and saw something that reminded him of his own father, the stubborn dignity of someone who refused to surrender his humanity even in the face of overwhelming hardship. "What is your name, old father?" "I am Cacique Yurupari," the man replied, using the traditional title that marked him as a tribal chief. "These are my people, what remains of them. The Spanish came with soldiers and priests, saying they would bring civilization and salvation. Instead, they brought only death and slavery. Those who would not convert, those who would not give up their lands, were marked for extermination." As Blackthorne looked around the clearing, he could see the evidence of the refugees' desperate situation. Children sat listlessly in their mothers' arms, too weak from hunger to play or cry. Men who should have been in the prime of life leaned against trees for support, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. Cooking pots sat empty over cold fires, and the few fishing nets he could see were torn beyond repair. "How long since you had food?" asked Jacques Dubois in his broken Spanish, his physician's training making him acutely aware of the symptoms of starvation he was witnessing. 3 days for the children," Yurupari replied. 5 for the adults. We caught some fish last week, but the nets are broken, and we have no materials to repair them. The fruit trees on this island were stripped bare weeks ago. We've been eating roots and tree bark, but even those are nearly gone." Blackthorne felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced years ago when he had watched his Royal Navy captain turn away those other refugees. He looked at his own men and saw his own thoughts reflected in their faces. They were pirates, men who lived by taking what they needed from others, but they were not monsters. The sight of children starving was something that transcended any considerations of profit or self-preservation. Without a word, Blackthorne began emptying his own pockets of the hard biscuits and dried meat that constituted his personal emergency rations. His crew, understanding immediately what their captain was doing, followed suit. Within minutes, they had placed before the amazed refugees every scrap of food they had brought ashore, along with their water bottles and even the ship's medical supplies that Jacques always carried. "Captain," Malik whispered urgently, "this is all the food we have left. If we give this away, we will have nothing for the journey to port." Blackthorne looked at the Moorish navigator, a man whose loyalty and friendship he valued above almost anything else in the world. "Then we'll have to find another way to survive, won't we? I've seen what happens when good men do nothing while innocents suffer. I won't be that man again." The reaction of the refugees to this unexpected generosity was immediate and overwhelming. Mothers wept openly as they fed their children for the first time in days. Men who had been too weak to stand found strength they hadn't known they possessed. But most remarkably, Cacique Yurupari immediately began organizing the distribution of the food to ensure that the youngest and weakest were fed first, even though he himself was clearly near collapse from hunger. "Why?" Yurupari asked Blackthorne when the immediate crisis of feeding the children had been addressed. "Why do pirates, men who live by taking from others, give their own food to strangers?" Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment, watching a small girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old eating a piece of hard biscuit with the reverent attention that most people reserved for the finest delicacies. Because sometimes being human matters more than being safe. Because sometimes doing what's right is more important than doing what's profitable. As the afternoon wore on, Blackthorne and his men learned more about the refugees' story. They were survivors from half a dozen different tribal groups that had lived along the Mosquito Coast, a region that had become a battleground between Spanish colonial authorities and the indigenous peoples who refused to accept European domination. The Spanish had launched what they called a pacification campaign, but which was in reality a war of extermination designed to clear the land for plantation agriculture. The refugees had escaped in fishing boats and canoes, carrying only what they could grab as their villages burned. They had hoped to reach the British settlements in Jamaica or the pirate strongholds of Tortuga, but storms and contrary winds had driven them to this uninhabited island instead. Their boats had been damaged beyond repair in the surf, leaving them stranded with no means of escape and no way to signal for help. As the sun began to set, painting the Caribbean sky in shades of gold and crimson, Blackthorne made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "We'll take you off this island," he told Yurupari, "all of you. My ship can carry your people to safety." But Captain," protested Timothy O'Brien, his Irish accent thick with concern, "we barely have enough supplies to reach port ourselves. How can we feed all these people for a week or more at sea?" Blackthorne looked at his Irish quartermaster, a man whose judgment he trusted and whose concerns were always practical. "We'll figure it out, Tim. We always do. But I won't leave these people here to die when we have the power to save them." The evacuation began at first light the next morning. Using the ship's boats, Blackthorne's crew ferried the refugees from the beach to the Sovereign's Revenge in groups of 6 or 8. The process took most of the morning, but by noon all 43 survivors were aboard the pirate ship, along with what few possessions they had managed to save from their destroyed villages. The overcrowding was severe, with refugees filling every available space on deck and below. But what struck Blackthorne most was how his own crew responded to the situation. Instead of complaining about the inconvenience or the drain on their resources, his men immediately began sharing their own belongings. Hammocks, blankets, tools, and even personal treasures that they had accumulated over years of piracy. Jacques Dubois established a makeshift medical station and began treating the refugees for malnutrition, dehydration, and various injuries they had sustained during their ordeal. Malik ibn Hassan worked with some of the younger refugees who had navigation experience, sharing his knowledge of the local currents and wind patterns. Even the most hardened members of the crew found themselves helping with the children, teaching them sailors' knots or sharing stories of their own adventures. But the fundamental problem remained. They simply did not have enough food and water to sustain everyone for the journey to port. By the third day at sea, Blackthorne was faced with the grim reality that some people were going to starve unless they found another solution. It was Cacique Yurupari who provided the answer. The old chief approached Blackthorne on the morning of the fourth day, his weathered face grave but determined. "Captain," he said in his careful English, "there is something I must tell you, something that may help us all." Yurupari explained that he was not just a village chief, but a hereditary leader, whose authority extended over a confederation of tribes that had ruled the Caribbean islands for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. His people had hidden caches of treasure throughout the region, gold and precious stones that had been accumulated over generations and concealed from Spanish conquistadors and English privateers alike. On the island of San Cristobal, 3 days sailing from here, my ancestors buried a treasure that would buy every ship in Port Royal, Yurupari said. "I am the only one who knows its location, and I am too old to retrieve it myself. But if you help my people reach safety, I will share that knowledge with you." Blackthorne studied the old chief's face, looking for any sign of deception or desperation that might make him invent such a story. But Yurupari's eyes were clear and honest, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of ancient authority and inherited wisdom. "You would trust pirates with such a secret?" Blackthorne asked. "I would trust you," Yurupari replied simply. "You gave your last food to starving strangers. You risked your own life to save people who could offer you nothing in return. Such actions reveal the true nature of a man's soul." The decision to change course for San Cristobal was not made lightly. The island was in Spanish-controlled waters, and there was always the risk of encountering colonial patrols or treasure hunters. But with their supplies running dangerously low and no other options available, Blackthorne ordered Malik to set a new course. San Cristobal proved to be a small, heavily forested island with a natural harbor that was hidden from view by towering cliffs. As they anchored in the concealed bay, Blackthorne could see why the indigenous peoples had chosen this place to hide their most valuable possessions. The terrain was rugged and inhospitable, with dense jungle that would discourage casual exploration and treacherous currents that would make navigation difficult for anyone who didn't know the local waters. Yurupari led a small party ashore, including Blackthorne, Jacques, Malik, and several of the strongest refugees. Following paths that were invisible to European eyes, the old chief guided them deep into the island's interior, past ancient petroglyphs and stone monuments that spoke of civilizations far older than anything the Spanish had encountered in their conquest of the Caribbean. The treasure cache was hidden in a natural cave system that had been modified by human hands over many generations. As they descended into the underground chambers, their torches revealed something that took Blackthorne's breath away. The cavern was filled with golden artifacts, ceremonial masks, jewelry, religious icons, and vessels of exquisite craftsmanship that represented the artistic achievements of Caribbean civilizations spanning centuries. But it was not just the gold that amazed Blackthorne. There were also caches of precious stones, pearls the size of bird eggs, and worked silver that gleamed like captured moonlight. The total value was beyond calculation, enough wealth to buy a small country or finance a war that could reshape the balance of power in the Caribbean. This represents the accumulated wealth of 12 tribal confederations, Yurupari explained as they moved through the cavern. For 500 years, our people have brought their most precious possessions here for safekeeping. Gold taken from Spanish ships, pearls harvested from secret beds, gems traded from the mainland. All of it has been waiting for the day when it would be needed to ensure our people's survival. As they began the process of loading the treasure onto their boats, Blackthorne found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being entrusted to him. This was not just wealth, but the cultural heritage of entire civilizations, the accumulated legacy of peoples who had ruled these islands long before Columbus had ever dreamed of sailing west. The return journey to the ship took most of the day, as they made multiple trips to transport the treasure safely through the jungle and across the water. By evening, the hold of the Sovereign's Revenge was filled with enough gold and jewels to make every man aboard wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. But the real surprise came the next morning as they prepared to leave San Cristobal and continue their journey to safety. As the sun rose over the eastern horizon, Blackthorne was awakened by shouts from the lookout in the crow's nest. "Ships approaching from the south, Captain. Multiple vessels, flying colors I don't recognize." Blackthorne grabbed his spyglass and climbed to the highest point on his ship, expecting to see Spanish warships or English privateers coming to investigate their presence in these waters. Instead, what he saw was a fleet unlike anything in his experience. 12 ships of various sizes approached the island, their sails bearing symbols and designs that clearly marked them as vessels of indigenous construction. These were not European ships that had been captured and modified, but vessels built according to traditional Caribbean designs, with the shallow drafts and flexible rigging that allowed for navigation of coastal waters and hidden channels. As the lead ship drew closer, Blackthorne could see that its deck was crowded with warriors wearing the traditional dress and war paint of different tribal groups. But these were not refugees or escaped slaves. These were free men and women, well-fed and well-armed, sailing their own ships under their own authority. The lead vessel approached close enough for its captain to hail the Sovereign's Revenge in accented but clear English. "Ahoy, Captain Blackthorne! I am War Chief Taino Guacanagari of the Windward Alliance. We come bearing greetings from the 12 tribal confederations of the Caribbean." As the indigenous fleet arranged itself around the Sovereign's Revenge in a formation that was clearly ceremonial rather than threatening, Blackthorne began to understand what was happening. Word of his rescue of the refugees had somehow spread through the network of indigenous communities that still existed throughout the Caribbean, hidden from European colonial authorities, but very much alive and active. A delegation from the indigenous fleet was invited aboard the Sovereign's Revenge, and Blackthorne found himself facing representatives of tribal groups from across the Caribbean. There were Taino chiefs from the Greater Antilles, Kalinago warriors from the Windward Islands, and Garifuna leaders from the mainland coast. Each brought with them gifts of food, water, and supplies that immediately solved the problem of sustaining the refugees during their journey to safety. But more than that, they brought an offer that would change Blackthorne's life forever. War Chief Guacanagari, speaking for the entire alliance, offered the pirate captain something unprecedented in the history of Caribbean piracy: full membership in a confederation of free indigenous peoples who controlled vast territories unknown to European cartographers. "You showed honor when you could have chosen profit," Guacanagari explained as they met in Blackthorne's cabin. "You chose to save our people when you could have saved only yourself. Such actions create debts that can only be repaid with loyalty and friendship that lasts for generations." The alliance that was formed that day created a new power in the Caribbean, a confederation that included not just indigenous tribes, but also pirates, escaped slaves, and others who had rejected European colonial authority. Blackthorne found himself not just a pirate captain, but an admiral in a fleet that controlled secret harbors, hidden supply caches, and intelligence networks that stretched from Florida to the coast of South America. The treasure from San Cristobal was divided according to principles that honored both pirate tradition and indigenous customs. Each refugee family received enough gold to start a new life in safety, while the tribal confederations used their share to purchase weapons and supplies for their ongoing resistance to European colonization. Blackthorne and his crew received enough wealth to retire in comfort, but more importantly, they gained something that no amount of gold could buy: a place in a community that valued honor and humanity above profit and power. The story of Captain Ezra Blackthorne and the treasure of San Cristobal became legend throughout the Caribbean. Sailors in every port told the tale of the pirate who gave his last food to starving refugees and woke up to find 12 tribal fleets offering him mountains of gold. The Spanish authorities placed enormous bounties on his head, but every attempt to capture him failed, protected as he was by an intelligence network that included every indigenous community in the Caribbean. Years later, when Blackthorne was an old man living peacefully in a hidden valley in the mountains of Jamaica, surrounded by children and grandchildren from a dozen different cultural backgrounds, he would tell visitors that the greatest treasure he had ever found was not gold or silver, but the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create bonds that last for generations. The confederation that grew from that meeting at San Cristobal continued to operate for decades, a hidden power that protected refugees, freed slaves, and maintained the independence of indigenous communities throughout the Caribbean. The European colonial powers never fully understood how a simple act of sharing food with starving strangers had created their greatest challenge in the New World. But for those who lived through it, the lesson was clear. Generosity is not weakness, and sometimes the greatest treasures are earned not through conquest, but through compassion.